Hi everyone, Professor Carson here. Wanted to talk really quick about the speech rubric. So this right here is the grading rubric for all of your speeches. You can find this attached to each of the assignments. But basically this is how you are scored for all of your speeches. There are 8 competencies, each with 1 to 5 points that you can be scored for. And it should total up to 40 points. Now, an important note on that is that let's say that you score 2s and 3s in all of these competencies and end up with a total score of 20 out of 40. That does not mean that you get a 50% on the assignment. There's a pretty significant curve, so I think it's, if you get 20 points, I think that equates to about 75%, and then 30 something points gets you to about 90%. So don't think that a 20 out of 40 means you failed the assignment. You're still on a pretty big curve, but this is just a good way of organizing, are things excellent? Are things average or acceptable? Or do things need significant improvements? So let me start at the top and just explain each of these. So competency 1 is assignment specifics. So does it appear that you've prepared for the speech? That would go into your outlining, planning what you want to say. Does it look like you've practiced for the speech? This goes more into the delivery. Does it look like you've practiced delivering the speech to a camera or to other people before? This is the one that people lose the most points on most of the time. Is it within the specified time? So if a assignment is 5 to 7 minutes and you give me 4 to 5 minutes worth of content, I'll take away 1 point. 3 to 4 minutes of content instead of the 5 minutes, I'll take away another point, and so on is how I deduct points for that. And then lastly, meets assignment requirements. This goes more to if I have you do an informative speech and you instead try to do a speech persuading your audience to do something, that's not meeting the requirements, and so you'll lose points here for that. And then vice versa, if I ask you to persuade your audience to do something and you're only informing them about a topic, then you're not meeting the assignment requirements. Competency 2 is your introduction. So all of these points are necessary as part of the introduction. You just did your diagnostic speech. You didn't know this. That's completely fine. But as we get into the first few weeks of this course, you'll learn each of these elements and how to do this. The first one is your attention gaining material. So something you say at the beginning of your speech to get the attention of the audience. This can be a fun fact. This can be a very short story of how you're personally related to the topic. This can be a statistic. This can be a quote, but something that gets the audience's attention without necessarily giving them content that they're not prepared to hear. The next is your thesis. Why are you giving this speech? What is the purpose of this speech? It's very good to simply state that for the audience so they have a very clear understanding of what your speech is here to do. Relevance material. This one I don't look too closely at, but it's generally a good idea to talk about why you're qualified to give this speech. This can be either because you have personal experience in this, like if you're going to give a first aid speech and talk about your experience in firefighting, then that would be relevant. Or if you're going to give a topic about first aid and you're going to talk about the research you did to prepare for this speech by looking up sources published by the Heart Association or wherever, that would go into the relevance of why you are a relevant speaker to be talking about this material. Next is preview of points. So you have to, for every speech, preview the points that you're going to be talking about before you begin talking about the body of your speech. So if I'm giving a speech about Abraham Lincoln, I'm going to preview that my points are his early life, his presidency, his life in politics, his presidency in the Civil War, and his death. And I'm going to state those 4 points at the beginning of my speech before I start talking about what actually happened in his early life and give more of the body of that presentation. So make sure you preview your points before you go into your first point and talk about the real meat, the content of that speech. And lastly, the transition to body. So this is really just a signal or a signpost to tell your audience that you're done with your introduction and you're transitioning into the main piece of your speech. This can be something simple like, so if we're ready, let's begin. Or something more creative like, let's begin by talking about and then state your first topic. You can be creative with that, but make sure there's some sort of sign there to tell your audience that you are transitioning. And we'll see more transitions here, and it'll be pretty similar. Competency 3 is going more into the information that you're presenting in the body of your speech. So now that we're past the introduction, it's about the body of the speech and the material that supports the main points of your speech. So do you have good information? Have you fact checked your information and made sure you're not giving away anything that's false? Are your main points clear and elaborated? This goes into, like I gave the example of giving a speech about Abraham Lincoln. The speech would be very difficult to listen to if I gave 100 facts about Abraham Lincoln and just listed them all the way down one by one. Instead, you should organize it into main points. My first main point, his early life. My second main point, his life in politics. And then I can put all of those little facts under each of those main points. And that's kind of what elaborated means here, is that I'm stating my main points. My main point might be that Abraham Lincoln had, had a difficult childhood in his early life, needing to learn how to get educated without having funding, like stuff like that. And when I elaborate on that, I might give little stories, or I might share little anecdotes or little details about his early life that help illustrate that main idea. But both of these are required to fully fill out that body of your presentation and make sure you have all the information you need. Like I said, you'll cover more of this in the weeks ahead, but make sure that's involved in your speech to get at the most points. Relevance of evidence. So if you're giving evidence, especially if you're talking about something that needs a lot of research, make sure that the evidence is relevant. Make sure that the evidence is the most recent evidence that you can find for this source, especially if you're looking at technology or medicine. And then make sure that it is relevant for what you're looking at. So if you're looking at epilepsy, make sure that the sources that you're looking at for health effects of, let's say you're looking at the effects of television on epilepsy, make sure you're getting a source that actually addresses epilepsy and not the effects of television on health in general or a specific health issue that's not even related to epilepsy. So make sure it's relevant both in terms of the topic of the sources that you have, as well as the date that the source was published, if that's going to be relevant to when you need to get information from. And on that note, for all of the speeches going forward, you are required to have academic sources. I think the number might vary, but check the assignment description for how many sources you need. And all of those sources need to be academic. So that does not include journalism articles. That does not include a lot of government sites will post, again, they're still journalism articles, but they seem more legitimate, but they aren't academic research articles. So for sources, only use academic resources for that. And I'm sure I'll go over that probably next week, but in terms of grading, you will lose points if you don't have the required number of sources, if your sources aren't relevant to your speech, or if your sources aren't legitimate in terms of being an academic source. And lastly, just make sure that you're smoothly introducing evidence. If I gave a speech where I'm just listing one thing off one by one, that's going to be a lot more rough to listen to than if I'm talking about a fact and then sharing the relevance to the topic and then talk about a different fact and give a comment on that. That's going to flow more smoothly for this speech, but that goes more into just how it feels. Next one is organization. So like I set up here, your main points should be all of your points should be organized into main points. Generally, you want that to be about 3 to 5 main points for your speech, regardless of what the length is. So if you have too many main points, that's too many things for your audience to be able to keep track of inside their head in terms of where the speech is starting and where it's ending and where you're traveling from beginning to end. So make it easy for the audience and make sure you have a clear organizational structure there. Internal transitions, so just like the introduction, you should have signposts that say, okay, we're done talking about Abraham Lincoln's life in politics before the presidency. Now let's talk about what happened after he became president. So a transition like that tells the audience that you're moving from one point to the next and helps them keep track of where you are in the speech. Same thing with transitioning from the body to the conclusion. Tell your audience in some way that you're done talking about the content of your speech, the main part of your speech, and now you're going to finish the speech off and conclude at the very end. Similar to the introduction, there are some required parts of the conclusion, and that part of that conclusion is going to be the transition. Another part is to summarize your points again. So at the beginning of your speech, you're telling your audience what you're going to be talking about through a summary. And at the end of your speech, you're again talking or telling the audience what you've talked about so that they can remember what the points of your speech were. That is a requirement for the conclusion to get full points. And then lastly, you'll need a final statement, something to leave the audience with. This can be something to have them think about the next time they encounter the topic. This can be something that an action statement, perhaps, that you want them to take on after listening to your speech, but some sort of final statement that concludes the speech, lets the audience know the speech is completely done, and hopefully leaves them with something tangible or impactful at the end of the speech. So to get full points and everything, just make sure you get all of these parts of the conclusion and that you are having transitions during your speech and that your speech is organized into main points. Language, bias-sensitive language, basically considering your audience and what words might be appropriate or inappropriate for them and then keeping that in mind. Specialized words is also important. If you're giving a speech about something that you're an expert in, keep in mind that not everyone in the class is going to have the same major as you or the same expertise as you. So if you're talking about aviation, for example, and not everyone in this class knows what a transponder is, don't use the word transponder 10 times without explaining what a transponder is. You might want to stop and explain what that term means before using it a bunch of times. So with the words that you use, make sure the words are understandable by the audience. Not necessarily being casual, but making sure that your audience isn't lost in trying to figure out what the words mean. Drawing attention to speaker or occasion. It's not super common, but the most common thing I see in this class is you might come up on stage and be super nervous or something, and you'll talk about the fact that you're nervous, or you're talking about, hey guys, sorry, my hair looks like a mess today. I got up at 5 a.m. And it might be a good way to reduce the tension in the room or get your nerves out. But what it also does is it draws attention away from the topic of your speech and takes the attention of the audience away from the topic of your speech. And now the attention is on you as the speaker or the occasion, the classroom setting that's going on right now. So as you give your speech, try your best to calm yourself down before you get into the speech and start talking, so that as soon as your speech starts and between that and when you conclude your speech, everything you say is just talking about the topic of your speech and supporting that topic. That's just the best way to keep your audience focused on the topic of your speech. And then lastly, verbal fillers. So there are two types of fillers we talk about. One of them is verbal fillers. So these are fillers that use actual real words. Is a good example of a vocalic filler, which we'll talk about later, but is not a real word. If I talk about, you got to make sure that you reduce these fillers. And like I just used, those are real words, and those are being used as fillers when I just used them a second ago to fill the silence. Something you'll learn in this class is you have to learn to get comfortable with silence people are uncomfortable with silence. That's just a natural thing. And so we use fillers to try to fill that silence, but in professional public speaking, you want to avoid that as much as possible. And so you'll lose a couple points. You won't lose a lot of points. The way I grade it is I'll take away 1 point if I see 3 to 5 fillers in a speech, and then I'll take away 2 points. Or sometimes I'll take away 2 points if it's really bad. Like if I'm hearing a filler every single sentence, that's when I'll take away 2 points, and then 3 if it's so bad that I can't focus on your speech at all. So just try to avoid those fillers. Something comes with practice, but don't stress about it if you can't remove them entirely. Vocal presentation, this is the sound of your voice. How does your voice sound? How fast or slow is it? How expressive is it, or lack of expression, depending on what you're going for? Changes in pitch that might be helpful or unhelpful for your speech. We'll talk later about how to use expressiveness depending on the topic that you have and what emotion you're trying to get your audience to feel. And lastly, intensity and volume. So how loud is it? Can the audience hear you? Or is it a little quiet and harder to hear? Is it very intense and you want people to be intense with you in the situation? Or is it very soft and you're trying to give a calming presence to the people who are listening to your speech? All 5 of these things are things that you can use your voice to get your audience to feel a certain way. But then at the other side of it, especially with rate and volume, those are more things that have to do with clarity. So can I clearly understand what you're saying? Or are you talking too fast or too slow? Or are you talking too quietly for me to know what you're saying? This is pronunciation, so using correct grammar, using articulation. This just means, am I clearly able to understand what you're saying? This also goes into memorized rhythm. So if I'm reading something word for word, that's going to sound a lot different than if I'm coming up with the words as I'm talking about something. And you generally want to avoid using a memorized rhythm. So we don't have any manuscript speeches in the class. That means a speech where you read word for word something that you prepared in advance. Most of these speeches, you'll create an outline and then use the outline to guide what you're saying, or maybe even use note cards for that. But even if you're using a manuscript outside of this class, try to avoid that rhythm of you're just reading something and you read it word for word. Like if I'm reading this, I'm just going to say, some of the required aspects are included, some elements are unclear or need to be strengthened. That sounds very unnatural. It doesn't sound like I'm connecting with you as an audience. It just sounds like I'm reading something off of a page. So that sound, that feeling that you get when you read something, try to avoid that rhythm that you use to speak when you're reading something off of a page. Delivery. So the delivery of your speech, this goes into kind of the vocals again, but avoiding halting. So if you're continuously stopping in the middle of sentences to try to figure out your next word, and I don't mean stopping, like I've been halting a lot during the speech for maybe half a second or full second as I figure out what to say next, that's completely fine. If you're halting for 3 to 5 seconds, that's distracting from your speech. It's making your audience halt with you. And now they're also halting as they're trying to listen to you in the speech. So that's more of a severe, you stop for 5 seconds because you don't know where you're going next with the speech. Try to avoid that. Choppy. That's similar to halting, but more frequent. So if you're halting 5 times in the span of one sentence, even though you're not halting for a full 3 to 5 seconds, that's going to be really distracting too. So try to avoid that. And then similarly to avoiding reading off of a page, if you are actually reading off of a page and it becomes noticeable, that also shows here. If it looks like you're looking at your notes a lot and you're more involved in looking and interacting with your notes than you are looking and interacting with the audience, that's going to show up in the way your voice sounds. And then lastly, vocalic fillers. So these are the fillers that are not words. These are all things to try to avoid. And like I said, I'll take away 1 point if it happens a couple times during a speech, 2 points if it's every single sentence, and then if I can't even follow your speech, 3 points for that. Last one, nonverbal support. So we talked a lot about the verbal side of things. This is the nonverbal side of things. This is mainly going to be eye contact and hand gestures. And then kind of secondarily to that is going to be facial expressions, your body language, other than hand gestures. The 2 main things I will be grading is eye contact and hand gestures. So in your speeches, I know it's going to be on video, but in this case, your audience is the camera. So when you are trying to make eye contact with the audience, the best way to do that is to look directly at the camera. And sometimes you can be really tempted to look down at the screen, whether you have notes there or whether you have your webcam there so you can see how you look. Avoid using that as a mirror. Look at the camera because that's who your audience is. And especially if you're going to be giving a formal or a professional presentation to an audience and record it ahead of time, you're going to want to be looking at the camera if you're not in a Zoom meeting where you can see audience reactions. And then hand gestures, something with that. I know it's a bit hard, but you will be graded on hand gestures. So make sure that I would recommend pushing your camera back a bit, or maybe pulling your chair back or standing further back from the camera so that more of your body can be seen than when you're using your hand gestures normally, you'd be able to see them. You could also try, if you're still closer up to the camera, putting your hands right in front of your face and making sure they're visible that way. But hand gestures are an important skill that I want you to learn in this class one way or another. So make sure the camera can see those hand gestures so that we can practice using them in a speech. Since it's good to use on video, but then especially when you're off of the camera and giving an in-person speech, hand gestures are super important for that. Note cards, I'm not really grading note cards since I can't look at your note cards, so the main thing for note cards is going to go back to eye contact. If I look at your speech and you spend 90% of the speech staring at your computer screen or staring at physical note cards that you have in your hand, yeah, that's a sign to me that you're looking at your notes instead of the audience, or instead of trying to connect with the audience through the camera. And so you're going to lose a point or two for that. And this is a good recommendation to do, but like I said, I'm not looking at your note cards, so I can't grade you on this. So eye contact, 50%, and that's a lot lower than how I grade my in-person speeches, but I just know it's a lot more difficult with being an online class. So 50% of the time, I want you to be looking at the camera. If you get less than 50%, I'll dock a point. And then if it gets down to a point where you're only looking at the camera maybe 25% of the time, or less than that, 10%, that's when I'll take 2 points away. And then same thing with hand gestures, where if you only have maybe 3 to 5 hand gestures in your whole speech, I'll take away a point. If I don't see any hand gestures, I'll take away 2 points. If you have any questions on this, feel free to let me know. Another thing is, and this is a good thing to know for all of your classes, but grades are always, what's the word? If you don't agree with a grade, you can always say something. And I think my syllabus has a specific timeline for when you have to say something, but I completely invite you to let me know if you think I graded something wrong, or if you think you deserve a little bit of grace in a certain area, and I will review it. But the way I'm grading this is just to give you the best feedback on how to improve, both for online speaking like we do with the cameras and the videos in this class, as well as in-person speaking when you go and you have to actually use more hand gestures or make eye contact with the audience. And if you have any questions about this rubric, let me know. And then same thing with your grades. Once you've finished a speech and I give you back this rubric graded, let me know if you have any questions on that. All right, I hope you all have a good week too. Let me know if you have any questions. See ya.